Well, good evening. My name is Zach Workowich, and I'm with History Colorado. My office is at El Pueblo History Museum. Tonight's event is part of our Borderlands of Southern Colorado online lecture series offered by History Colorado Museums, El Pueblo History Museum, Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, Trinidad History Museum, and Ute Indian Museum. Before we begin tonight's program, in the spirit of healing and education, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are our partners. We consult with them when we plan exhibits, collect, preserve, and interpret artifacts, do archaeological work, and create educational programs. We recognize these indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of this land. As always, we'd like to thank the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area and Colorado State University Pueblo for their continued support of this series. If you'd like to join in support of our Borderlands project, we invite you to support the initiative by joining Fronteras, the Borderlands of Southern Colorado Society. It's a new part of our History Colorado membership. By making a contribution to Fronteras, you're connecting with others who share your special interest in the understanding and scholarship of the Borderlands. Tonight's talk is Carving Up a Continent, State Boundaries in the American West, presented by Dr. Derek Everett. Dr. Everett is the author of Creating the American West, Boundaries and Borderlands, and is an instructor at both Colorado State University and Metropolitan State University of Denver. I'm going to turn it over to Derek now. We hope you enjoy.
All righty, I'm pretty sure I've got my mute button worked there so that everyone can hear me. It is my delight and pleasure to be with everyone here this evening. It's been fun to watch in the chat as names crop up and places crop up of where everyone is tuning in from. I had my first lecture for the semester via an online format in my Colorado history class this morning. So we were talking about Folsom sites and Clovis sites and Dent and Lamb Spring and Rollins Pass, all sorts of terrific Colorado early history today, and a little bit more recent with the creation and the imposition of state boundaries in the American West for our topic this evening. So again, I'm delighted to be with you. I'm so grateful that you've been able to join us this evening and help support History Colorado. I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint so that we can, so that I can share that image. I know that looking at me is a beautiful thing. You've perhaps been traumatized by my photo on the Facebook notice. So hopefully the PowerPoint will be a little bit more beautiful and attractive here. Let's say share my screen, and I want that. And that's right. Yeah, Zach and Eric will be helping to coordinate questions in the chat if you have any of those as we go along. So please feel free to send in questions or pipe up as need be. So let's see. There we go. Yep. So when it comes to state boundaries in the American West, we are certainly living in a time not only where state boundaries in our own neck of the woods are very much up for debate and discussion, but the concept of boundaries and borders in general. You know, we look at an image like this one of what just seems like a barbed wire fence line, you know, a property line stretching off into the distance. This is actually in the San Luis Valley. You've got Colorado on the left and New Mexico on the right there. Otherwise, a homogeneous environment with this invisible but incredibly powerful cleave that runs right down the middle of it. And when it comes to the significance of boundaries and borders for Americans in particular, there's essentially two big camps as to what significance boundaries and borders have. On the one hand, certainly there's a great desire in the part of some to have boundaries that are not only well marked, but enforced with walls, with guards, with new technology, the build the wall debate that certainly has been so powerful and prominent over the past several years, a reminder of just how important these otherwise invisible divides can be to some people. On the other hand, you also have a movement to essentially act without boundaries. There are so many organizations that include the phrase without borders today. You know, Doctors Without Borders is probably the most famous one. Lawyers Without Borders. I have some logos of different organizations that are the Without Borders groups here on this slide. Undoubtedly, my favorite there on the right-hand side, Clowns Without Borders. I mean, that's just a Stephen King novel in the making there. I'm not sure what we should be thinking about that. But nonetheless, boundaries are essential and inescapable in American life. And whether we're talking about international boundaries, intranational boundaries, state boundaries, county boundaries, school district boundaries. If you've ever been embroiled in an argument over which school your kids or you got to go to because of where the invisible line was, you've had that personal feeling of the significance of a boundary. Counties and cities, but even more simple than that, boundaries that we interact with on a daily basis. How many times have you been at Walmart or the grocery store and there's that pinhead out in the parking lot who can't see the stripes that are painted right there that they can put their car in, and they've parked in some wonky way. I don't know, maybe you or I have been that pinhead at some point in time or another. But when we're looking at things, even like parking stripes in a parking lot, it's a reminder of just how prevalent and powerful boundaries are to the United States, to American life. For example, in 2013, when Colorado was passing laws restricting firearms magazines and so on in the wake of the Aurora theater shooting, this political cartoon was drawn suggesting that you could open a fine store on the Colorado-Wyoming line. You could buy all the fireworks and gun magazines you wanted to on one side and all the marijuana you wanted to on the other, and probably make a booming business there at the state line store. For as powerful a place as boundaries have in our existence and in debates and discussions over just about anything in American life today, it's important to remember that our boundaries have evolved quite a bit, whether it's national boundaries through territorial expansion, whether it's state boundaries that have been created and modified and erased and redrawn over the years. So they are far more malleable than we might tend to think. And a good example of the flexibility and the changeability of boundaries comes from the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado. In 2018, just 3 years ago now, there was a ceremony at a park in Alamosa, right in the heart of the San Luis Valley, to dedicate a new sign in a park called Cole Park in the heart of Alamosa. And the sign was to commemorate the presence of Texas, the claim at least of Texas to the San Luis Valley and to territory stretching even farther north up into what's now Wyoming. When Texas declared its independence in the 1830s, it declared boundaries that you can see on the map on the left side of your screen there, you know, the area that we think of as Texas today, plus this stovepipe that stretched up through the mountains up to the Rio Grande in the west, to the Arkansas River to the north, and then eventually stretching all the way up to about Rawlins, Wyoming today. And in 2019, there was a dedication, the picture down in the bottom right-hand corner, a dedication for a sign commemorating Texas's claim to the area. Part of this was a campaign that the Daughters of Texas, kind of the Daughters of the American Revolution, but just focused on Texas. They were doing a campaign to try to flex Texas history even beyond its existing borders today. It didn't hurt that the mayor of Alamosa was then and remains a native Texan, so he was kind of excited about the process. He's standing on the far right in the picture down there. one thing that I find amusing about the sign that commemorates Texas's claim to the area is that the park that it was put in is actually on the west side of the Rio Grande in Alamosa. So the sign itself is standing in a place where Texas never claimed. Now, granted, Texas, whether, however much you claimed, it didn't control any of that area. It barely controlled anything much past the Gulf Coast in the 1830s, 1840s. But it's a good reminder of the difference between claim and control. You can claim a lot, but whether you can control something, that's another matter entirely. Now, lest we pick on Texas too much, certainly Texas isn't the first place to think about that. And when you think of Texas, you think of how proud they are of the size and the shape of their state. You can find just about anything in the shape of the state of Texas. A few examples here, from lollipops to waffle makers, houses and swimming pools. The notion that Texas is trying to talk about how its borders extended so far, when really there's no state in the Union that is more proud of its shape, at least its modern shape, than the state of Texas. I mean, Colorado, we're very proud of our shape too, but it's a relatively non-controversial shape. I remember in 2011, 10 years ago now, when the new History Colorado Center was being dedicated in downtown Denver, the architects said that they had taken inspiration for the design of the History Colorado Center from the shape of the state of Colorado, which, I mean, let's face it, that's not the most imaginative architectural choice. If we were the shape of Texas or Florida or something, sure, but taking inspiration from a rectangle, I guess you take it where you can get it from. But Texas's claims to parts of Colorado and Wyoming and beyond are not unique. Going back to the early English colonies that were being established along the Atlantic coast in the early 1600s, the English claimed what were called sea-to-sea charters. And you can see a couple of maps of these. The small one in the top right-hand corner was the sea-to-sea charter for Virginia that was declared in excuse me, in 1609, which started a little bit south of the modern state line of Virginia and extended out to California. And the northern line went in this massive arc all the way up to Alaska. Now, Virginia claimed that. It controlled hardly any of that for the first few generations of its history. But the big map shows altered claims extending Virginia and the Carolinas from sea to sea. Now, the English colonists at the time in the 1600s didn't really have any idea how big sea to sea was, how large that was. But it's a reminder that, even though Texas might have dreamed big in the middle of the 1800s, they certainly weren't the first. There was a similar grandiose claim. Again, whether or not you could control that was certainly another matter entirely. When it comes to state boundaries, and in particular west of the Mississippi River, over the span of the 19th century all the way up to the present day, creating these boundaries was an incredibly contentious process. And it's not really one that we think of that often. When you look at a map of the United States, you just, oh, yeah, that looks familiar. That makes sense. And really, the only time most of us consider a state boundary is when we're driving from one state to another and you come across some massive fancy new sign celebrating the end of one giant rectangle and the beginning of another. But that mindset obscures just how complicated the creation of these boundaries was, how that process unfolded over the span of the 19th century in particular. Now, when it comes to state boundaries today, most of them, unlike certainly national boundaries, you wouldn't really notice them. They don't jump out at you. They're not a major obvious presence, with a few exceptions. For example, you can go to the north shore of Lake Tahoe, to the Calneva Resort, briefly owned in the 1960s by none other than Frank Sinatra. And there at the Calneva, taking advantage of its name, you can stand in front of the fireplace that straddles the state line. You can see the gold line on one side for California and the silver line on the other for Nevada. You can swim in the swimming pool from one state to another on the, I don't know, maybe the 3 days a year when the outdoor swimming pool at Lake Tahoe is warm enough to do such a thing. But a state boundary so prominent, like the one at the Calneva, is the exception rather than the rule. For example, you look at a picture like this, and it's a lovely forest, a path running through the forest there. Doesn't look like anything particularly special until you discover that that's actually a path that follows the line between the states of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. You have rivers. I'll be talking more about the notion of rivers as boundaries in a couple of minutes. But you have, for example, massive rivers like the Mississippi here that are good for hauling cargo, or but in the 19th century were seen as barriers as often as they were unifying forces. So this picture, for example, shows not just the Mississippi River, but the fact that it divides the states of Louisiana on one side and Mississippi on the other. Another good river example here, this is the Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River, which is impressive enough on its own, but of course it also straddles the line between the states of Oregon and Washington. I've always wanted to see them paint a stripe down the middle of the dam, to kind of like the Calneva, to show, which side is which state. And I obviously have no pull whatsoever with the Army Corps of Engineers. They've ignored all of my line painting entreaties, so my dream has been denied once more. But even more humble divisions. For example, this is a nice little path, country path down, in the middle of a lovely rural countryside. But it's not just some miscellaneous road. It's also the road that divides the states of Iowa and Missouri. The monuments down in the corner, and especially that little obelisk one, stand at what was originally the northwestern corner of the state of Missouri. Missouri didn't stretch all the way, didn't have that little triangle piece in the northwest corner out to the Missouri River originally. That corner, that obelisk right there, was where it stopped. But as you're driving down this little 2-lane road, you've got Iowa on one side, Missouri on the other. Otherwise, it looks like any other rural landscape in the area. Another similar scene, just a random dirt road off the blacktop in a rural community, except that's Arkla Road with Louisiana on one side, Arkansas on the other. A dirt road in the middle of a farming community, farming country. Nothing particularly impressive about it, except it splits the states of South Dakota and Minnesota. So again, most state boundaries aren't particularly prominent, notable, as powerfully declared and a presence on the landscape as we tend to think international boundaries as being. That being said, every once in a while you've got some fences as well. This would look just like any other random fence line out in a rural region, except it's the boundary between Wyoming and Nebraska. I've always been very impressed at the amount of time and effort that Wyoming spends to trap its tumbleweeds before they escape into another state. By golly, we're going to sort of catch and hold on to our tumbleweeds. No one else is going to have the glory of those rolling weeds in the state of Wyoming. So their fences are working very well, I suppose, on that task. Some state boundaries have a bit more prominence of a mark than another. You've got this fence line extending off into the distance here, but you can also see this stone pillar in the foreground that kind of seems out of place. And it's actually part of the North Dakota-South Dakota boundary, the most formally marked of any state boundary in the country, really. When the Dakotas were split in 1889 and they came in as two separate states, the decision was, this is such a momentous event, we're going to mark our divide in a very formal way. And so every half mile from one side to the other between North and South Dakota, there are these quartzite markers that were set up for somewhere around about 300 miles. But when it comes to the how innocuous state boundaries seem to be right now, that belies how complicated their origins are, and very much the what happens west of the Mississippi River when it comes to creating state boundaries is a legacy of what happened on the east side of the river in the years just after the American Revolution. When the United States became an independent country in 1783 at the end of the Revolutionary War, you had the line of colonies along the Atlantic coast, to be sure, but those colonies had all sorts of overlapping claims as you moved farther to the west, and most of that is connected to the those sea-to-sea charters that some colonies had. Not every colony, but some of them did. So, for example, you could look up to what's now Detroit, Michigan. Let's see if I can. Oh, there's my mouse. I can move us up here. Move it up to Detroit, Michigan. In the years just after the American Revolution, Detroit was claimed by Virginia because of that massive angular sea-to-sea claim. It was claimed by New York. It was claimed by Massachusetts. All of these different new states saying, well, that's ours because we have this charter from back in the British days that says so. And one of the biggest challenges for the early United States, even before the Constitution was written, was how do we deal with all of the conflicting claims to the West, the land beyond the Appalachian Mountains? And the national government at that time, the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation government took over control of all of the land west of the Appalachians, essentially to resolve the disputes between the various states and to make sure that instead of a potential war between Massachusetts and New York and Virginia and Connecticut and North Carolina and Georgia and whoever else, that the national government would be in charge of deciding what would happen to that stretch of territory. And the national government decided that they would take that that now commonly held land and divide it up into new members of the Union, and essentially vitally equal members of the Union. Just because you're a brand new state doesn't mean that you aren't any less valuable than Rhode Island or New Jersey or South Carolina. So as new states are being created in the West, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and so on, they are created equally to the older states, and they are created on a pattern that was established by the national government before and during the creation of the Constitution. And the system that was created in the late 1700s was eventually extended across North America as the United States grew. Over the course of half a century, from 1803 to 1853, the United States tripled in size in a remarkably short period, again, just 50 years. The United States tripled in size in three ways: through purchase, buying land claims, the Louisiana Purchase, probably most famously. The second is through negotiation. We negotiated with other countries for land claims for Florida, for the Oregon Country. And number three, there was conquest. There was something out there we want, and we took it. The revolution in Texas, the conquest of northern Mexico in the late 1840s, what's labeled here as the Mexican Cession. Through these three ways, through purchase, negotiation, and conquest, the United States triples in size in an incredibly short period of time. And one of the big challenges is we have claimed this land. How do we control it? How do we make it work with the pattern that had been established on the east side of the Mississippi River? And one of the essential ways that that was done was to start creating new political communities in it, slowly but surely introducing state boundaries west of the Mississippi River to carve up that land into units that would work on the pattern that had been established on the east side of the Mississippi River, essentially to create new equal members of the club, of the Union, that could function on an equal basis with New York and Wisconsin and Alabama and the rest. Over the course of the 19th century, there were 48 lines drawn west of the Mississippi River. There are 48 state boundaries. For example, when you come to Colorado and our number, Colorado has the Colorado Wyoming, Colorado New Mexico, Colorado Kansas, Colorado Oklahoma, Colorado New Mexico, and Colorado Utah lines. So we have 6 state boundaries, 7 if you want to count the point that touches the point of Arizona at Four Corners. But suffice to say, that's how I get the total number of 48 state boundaries, 48 individual lines that separate one distinct community from another. And one of the big debates in creating these Western state boundaries was whether to use geometry or geography to do it. Should we use the natural landscape? Should we use rivers? Should we use mountain ranges? Or should we just draw straight lines? And one of the big criticisms of Western state boundaries today is that the vast majority of them are geometric. Of those 48 lines in the American West, about a third incorporate rivers, either entirely or for a portion of their boundary. Only one incorporates a mountain range. That's the Idaho-Montana boundary, and not even all of the Idaho-Montana boundary is a mountain range, but part of it is. But this is the big debate in the late in the 1800s. Should we use the natural landscape or should we use just straight lines? And again, as I said, today that's the big criticism of Western state boundaries, is that most of them are geometry. And they're not criticized because we historians are afraid of geometry. I mean, we are, let's face it, it's a terrifying subject to people like me. But the notion that geometry, these straight lines, slices through environments and cultures, communities that would otherwise not be divided. I mean, the pictures that we looked at a few minutes ago, when you looked at one side of the Colorado and one side of the New Mexico line, they look like the same landscape. You'd think that these should be in the same political community. So the big debate today of geometry versus geography was echoed certainly in the 19th century. I should pause for a second and mention the picture that's here. This is a photograph of a collection of state highway signs near a place called Maysville, Arkansas, obviously where Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri come together. And if you've been looking at this picture over the past couple of moments and been trying to figure out how it makes sense, don't. It doesn't. I have actually spent far too much of my precious and brief existence standing in front of this sign at several different moments, explaining to the sign how impossible and ridiculous it is. And the sign doesn't care. It just stands there and drives me nuts. But if you're confused, trust me, I've been confused and infuriated by it as well. So when we think about boundaries today, for example, state boundaries in the West, the general consensus or the popular attitude is that state boundaries would be best if they followed geographic divisions, if they accommodated the landscape. And there's really 2 ways in the American West to do that. You could have boundaries that follow rivers or boundaries that follow mountains. So let's start, first of all, with the idea of a geographic boundary following a river. And you would think these are oftentimes big obstacles to traveling across land. It would make sense that this would be a political divide. And yet there are challenges. You look at the American West at the map here, there are plenty of massive rivers that you would think, well, we could make some political communities sensibly out of these rivers. The problem with using rivers, and the reason, number one, that rivers are a horrible, horrible idea for state boundaries, is that rivers do not stay put. Rivers are obnoxious and they have minds of their own and they wander all over the place. when you look at a river today, certainly when we're not having a flood or something, it's a big wet divide. But you have to remember that these rivers move constantly. The rivers change their channels, they move, they erode a little bit, they bite away a little here and there. These two maps are some federal government surveys of the Mississippi River and some of the various changes in the course of the Mississippi over the span of, say, the past couple centuries. And when you look at a map like this and you realize just how much the Mississippi has moved, you realize what a problem it would be to make state boundaries using a river like this, because a boundary needs to be definite. You need to be able to say, this is the law on this side of this invisible line, this is the law on that side, and we're going to be able to enforce it. When you have rivers like boundaries, for example, here the Mississippi, the big challenge is if the river changes its course, the state boundary doesn't. The Supreme Court has been ruling on this since the middle of the 1800s, and that once a boundary is set in law, it doesn't change, even if the river changes course. So you can look at a map of the Mississippi today. If you look close enough, there's all these little bits and pieces of one state on the other side of the river that comes because the river has changed course so many times over the span of the 200 years or so that these state boundaries were created. And the state boundary itself has not moved, which means that there's all these little pieces on the other side of the river that technically are the responsibility of the community on the other side. A friend of mine has done some research in dueling. That was his main focus when we were in graduate school, duels being fought for honor or what have you. And he noted that places like rivers here were incredibly popular places to have duels because you could walk into another state without really having done anything significant, but you're in a piece of land that belongs to the state that's mostly on the other side of the river. You could shoot at each other, and the other state probably wouldn't bother to try to enforce the anti-dueling law on you because it was too hard to get to you, and you were gone by the time you'd stop shooting. The state that you had lived in and crossed over from isn't going to prosecute you because, well, you didn't break any law because you shot at each other in a different state, even though it just took you 3 steps to get there. So rivers are an incredibly poor choice for making a state boundary or really any kind of boundary because they change so much and because a boundary defines authority. You can't have it so flexible. You can't have it so changeable. You need to be able to say, this is the rule on one side, this is the rule on the other, and to be able to know that with certainty, with essential focus. So rivers are a pretty challenging idea for creating a state boundary, except in places, say, like a canyon, Hell's Canyon on the Snake River, the Grand Canyon, or whatever. But then, canyons are pretty challenging to try to enforce laws in them. So if rivers are going to be so obnoxious and so ineffective as boundaries, why not use mountains, or at least prominent features in the landscape? They're not going anywhere. We're not going to have the problem of mountains moving the way rivers do. The map that's on your screen. So back on the same page. So as I said, rivers tend to move around. They are not reliable enough to be boundaries because you need a boundary to be permanent so that you know whose authority stops where and where the next authority begins. And so the next idea is to make boundaries out of landmarks that don't move, mountain ranges, for example, or at least prominent landscapes and landmarks. And the map that's on your screen right now was created in 1890 by John Wesley Powell. He was a one-armed Civil War veteran from the Union side. He was the first head of the U.S. Geological Survey. And the map that he created was a proposal for how to divide the West into states that followed hydrological regions, essentially river basins. So for example, if you look, I'll move my mouse down here. If you look down toward Colorado, our glorious rectangle would not exist. There would be one state for the Arkansas and Canadian river valleys down here. You'd have one state of the North and South Platte River. You'd have the what was then called the Grand River, the Upper Colorado. This pink one would be for the Green River of Wyoming and Utah and part of Colorado. The green down here at the bottom for the Rio Grande, and then the lower Colorado, this great big blob down here. And the idea was that if states were river basins, they wouldn't have, or they would be sort of self-contained units, and they wouldn't fight over water. As far as Powell was concerned, water is going to be the biggest challenge in the West because there's not much of it, and the more people who move in, the more battles there's going to be over water. And sweet merciful heavens, he was right. As I tell my students, if you want a job that's guaranteed for the rest of time, become a water lawyer, because that's not going to go out of fashion anytime soon. But when you look at the idea of using mountains or river basins as boundaries, there are some challenges that emerge as well. For example, the Continental Divide is a big, massive barrier certainly through much of Colorado. It could be a theoretical barrier easily enough, but once you get out, say, onto the Eastern Plains, how are you exactly going to define where the Arkansas River Basin stops and the South Platte River, or the Platte River Basin, begins? Are you just going to wander out there and say, well, I think it's this spot right here. Let's drop some water on the Great Plains and see if it starts rolling north or south? It's incredibly challenging to do that. And this shows that problem of authority again. You need to be able to define clearly where your boundary is. And if you're just saying it's the difference in the basin between one river and another, identifying exactly where that is going to be incredibly challenging. California and Nevada are probably the best example of this. When California was becoming a state in 1850, there was a debate as to whether it should have the geometric lines it has today, or whether the Sierra Nevadas should be a geographical eastern border for the state. And ultimately, California decided that it would be easier to define if they had these geometric lines. It would be more easy for a surveying team to identify and to mark than to try to estimate where the summit of the Sierra Nevadas was. When Nevada was created as a territory in 1861, for reasons passing understanding, Nevada's western boundary with California was identified as the Sierra Nevada Mountains. So technically, the territory of Nevada extended into the state of California because the state stopped, at this geometric line here, but Nevada's limit was whatever the ridge, the top ridge of the Sierra Nevada Mountains was. And the two states went not quite to court, but there were a number of legislative battles between the two of them as to which boundary should be enforced. And California legislators pointed out that if we chose the summit of the Sierra Nevadas, there would not be any point in the next 3,000 years when we would agree on where our border was. I mean, can you imagine a surveying team in the high Sierras trying to define exactly where the summit was to know where the laws of California stopped and where the laws of Nevada started? Again, when it comes to defining authority, there's no room for being vague. You need to know exactly where you are and exactly whose rules you're expected to follow. So at the end of the day, rivers stink as boundaries. Mountains don't really work as boundaries either because it's so impossible to identify exactly where they should stop and start. And this is how we get to geometry. And I apologize right now. As I apologize to my students, it's in the evening on a Thursday. You don't want to talk about geometry, but we're going to have to deal with it for just a second here. The idea of dividing the West by geometry really starts in 1785 with something called the Land Ordinance that was passed by the Confederation government, even before there was a federal government and the US Constitution. The Confederation government approved using, as you've got on the screen there, a series of geometric lines to start dividing up land in the West, starting as you see the map down toward the bottom left there. This all begins in eastern Ohio. And the idea was we need to start defining the land in the West as quickly as possible so we can sell it to American settlers. Not only that'll make money for the government, but it will help us control what we claim. That land was claimed by various American Indian cultures. And as far as the United States was concerned, we need to move our settlers into that area to replace their claim, to replace the Shawnee and the Delaware and the Wyandot and the Miamis and other native people in the region. It's how the United States controlled what it claimed. And so the imposition of this system of township and range, of surveying these squares and extending the system across from the Ohio River is where we begin the idea of using geometry to organize the land in the West. And ultimately, the system that started in Ohio would be extended across the continent. This map shows in color all of the parts of the United States that were divided up based on the system of the Land Ordinance, including all of Colorado. We had an essential division that was identified. You can see from the Kansas-Nebraska line right here, stretching out into Colorado, a major sort of survey anchor that was known as the baseline. And when you're in Boulder, when you're on Baseline Road, that road is on the 40th parallel. If you're on that road in Boulder, you're essentially driving along the Kansas-Nebraska line just a little bit farther to the west. So this system of geometry was created and extended across the continent with the goal of defining land and ownership, really control, authority, as clearly, as concretely as possible. And for all intents and purposes, for all the problems that geometric lines create, and they do create plenty of them, when we're talking about defining authority, when you need to be able to establish where the rules are and whose rules you follow, geometry in this case works better than geography, because you're able to say, all right, I'm on this side of the 41st parallel. I can do this, I can't do this. It's an easy, clear, quick way to define land. And for the surveyors at the time, it was a helpful way to define it as well. Certainly, it was a lot easier to say, okay, we need to survey the 37th parallel from Missouri out to Nevada. It's going to be easier for us to survey that than to try to figure out where the top of a mountain range is or the course of a river. And when it comes to understanding the complexity of how these lines are defined and created, the border between Colorado and New Mexico is a great example of that. When we think of the Colorado-New Mexico line, you think of things like Four Corners. You think of the state highway signs that you just kind of blast on by on 285 or I-25 as you're passing from one community to another. But the seeming simplicity of a state boundary is belied by the complexity of the story for Southern Colorado. For example, this map here, in the early 1800s, this was a map of Mexico at the time of its independence in the 1820s. And you can see up into what's now Colorado, sort of our rectangle would be right about here. about 2/3 of what's now Colorado was part of the New Mexico Territory for the nation of Mexico. There was no border, there was no division, there wasn't even a division between the New Mexico Territory and what was called Alta or Upper California in Mexico. They just figured somewhere out in the middle of that empty space in between the two is where New Mexico must stop and California begins. But it's not until the United States takes control of northern Mexico, the conquest in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when Mexico gets cut in half. The map in the top left-hand corner shows the comparison between the size of the United States in green and Mexico in orange in the early 1800s. And then the map below is the territory that the United States took claim of through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, sort of the darker gray of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. The rebellion of Texas, that was reinforced by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So all of that territory became part of the U.S. claim, and not necessarily control, but claim to be sure. So if the United States is going to control what it claims, it needs to carve this area up into new territories. And in 1850, the federal government starts imposing new boundaries to try to give the region a sense of organization. And you can see the two territories that were most important for us at the time, New Mexico and Utah. Colorado exists right about here today. New Mexico had what's known as the notch, this little piece that sticks up in the northern, sort of northeastern part of New Mexico at the time. Utah went all the way from California out to the Continental Divide. And this was the landscape of what's now Colorado up to the beginning of the Civil War. This is the map, essentially, of how things looked during the gold rush in the late 1850s. Kansas and Nebraska had become territories by then out here on the Great Plains. So there was no Colorado when William Green Russell and John Gregory and the rest were scratching out gold in 1858, 1859. They were doing that in Kansas and Nebraska and Utah and New Mexico. There was no Colorado territory at the time. When the Civil War is beginning, and certainly in early 1861, when Southern states are declaring themselves out of the Union, when they're seceding from the Union, the federal government realized we need to make sure the West is happy because we can't deal with cranky Westerners while we're dealing with cranky Southerners. And so we need to make sure that people in the West feel like they have communities that work for them. And that's how Colorado Territory came to be. We were organized on February 28th, 1861. In fact, the end of next month will be the 160th anniversary of a place called Colorado appearing on the map for the very first time. When Colorado Territory was defined, that notch from northeastern New Mexico disappeared and was absorbed into Colorado. There wasn't any particular reason for it other than 4 straight lines are tidy, they're easy to define. It wasn't really anything more complicated than that. The federal government needed to define a territory quickly and efficiently, and this is how they did that. Just slap 4 invisible lines on the west, we can define them quickly, and we'll know exactly where the authority of one territory stops and the next begins. Geometry allows us to do that. That being said, there will be a great consequence, certainly a cultural consequence, in the creation of the Colorado-New Mexico line, because it took about 3,000 people who were living in northern New Mexico, who had historic and religious and social ties to Santa Fe and to other communities to the south, and it suddenly lopped them off and attached them to a territory that was dominated by Anglos, that didn't really have an understanding, didn't really have an interest in working with 3,000 people of Hispano ancestry who are now attached to the rest of Colorado simply because it was easy to draw those four invisible lines. And in fact, there was a great deal of cultural division in the early days of Colorado between the Anglo population to the north and the Hispano population in the San Luis Valley, in the Arkansas River Valley, and around Trinidad. In the very first territorial legislature in 1861, when three members of this new Colorado legislature came up from the San Luis Valley, they arrived a couple days late because it was, well, hard to get from the valley up to Denver. And they sat there in silence as the debate raged in the legislature. And it took the Anglos a while to realize that the reason they weren't participating was they had no idea what was going on. They didn't speak English, because why on earth would they need to speak English? They've been living in a place where Spanish has been spoken for the past several centuries. And so there was a debate as to whether the legislature even needed to hire a translator, whether this was something that the Anglo-dominated legislature needed to do or should do. Ultimately, they did, but the fact that it was even a question at all shows the tension from the very beginning that was created by this political divide. In the years that followed, you had further reverberations of the ethnic tension in Colorado that was created by the 37th parallel, by the invisible line between Colorado and New Mexico. In 1863, you had the famous Espinosa murders of a couple of members of a family in southern Colorado who turned deadly in their expression of frustration and resentment on a cultural basis. There was infamously the Trinidad War at Christmas in 1867, when a Christmas Day wrestling match between an Anglo and a white, or an Anglo and a Hispano wrestler in Trinidad turned into a race riot that lasted for a week. So the creation of a community that was dominated by Anglos but had a large Hispano population that had been ripped away from the territory, from the people they knew, even though they hadn't moved themselves at all. They were right there. It's kind of Colorado's version of the famous saying in the Southwest: "We didn't cross the border crossed us." Usually, that's used to describe people of certainly Mexican identity originally in the early 1800s, who became Americans after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But in a sense, the same thing happened in Colorado. People who lived in the San Luis Valley never moved anywhere, but suddenly found themselves attached to an Anglo-dominated territory because an invisible line had been created in Washington, D.C. The impact, the reverberation of this state boundary and the tension along that state line, a cultural and a political tension, has echoed in diverse ways over the years, probably most famously in the Great Depression, when Colorado for about a week and a half declared martial law along the Colorado-New Mexico line, trying to prevent an annual influx of migrant workers coming in to harvest sugar beets in Colorado, or at least work in the beet fields. And the governor of Colorado, Ed Johnson, declared martial law in April of 1936, with the Colorado National Guard patrolling the boundary for about a week and a half. Johnson thought that this would be a good way to protect Colorado jobs for Colorado workers, as he called it. It essentially boiled down to, the white population of Colorado shouldn't lose jobs to Hispanos coming in from New Mexico, or even Mexican immigrants coming into Colorado from the nation of Mexico itself. And the blockade lasted for just a week and a half, until Johnson realized that unemployed white Coloradans would rather stay unemployed and collect relief checks than go work in the sugar beet fields, because working in the sugar beet fields is a godforsaken, exhausting, miserable stretch of work. And when he realized that the people he was protecting these jobs for didn't want those jobs. If he wanted sugar beets grown in Colorado, he had to open up the state line and let migrant workers come in and keep that industry going. We couldn't afford to lose it in the Great Depression, even though it was dependent on non-Coloradans to do the hardest work of tending to the beets. So, excuse me, there are these ongoing resonant legacies of the impact of the creation of the divide in southern Colorado that thankfully History Colorado has been doing over the past several years, has been doing a great job of exploring what we're referring to as the borderlands of southern Colorado, of this place where different cultures, different ideologies and religions come together and interact and essentially create a new and a special and a unique place. And there are exhibits at Fort Garland, at the Trinidad Museum, at El Pueblo, and coming soon to the History Colorado Center. There's going to be part of the Borderlands of Southern Colorado story, reflecting the complexity of this region, the incredible diversity, the excitement and the tension that exists at the same time in this place. That you can find some incredible exhibits at a number of the Colorado History Colorado sites. But I hope that the past hour or so has given you a sense of realizing state boundaries that are so easy to drive across at 75, 80, 85 miles an hour. State boundaries that seem so innocuous are actually incredibly complicated. How they were created, why they were created, where they exist. This is an incredibly thick, complex, complicated, convoluted story. So the next time we ponder how delightful life would be without boundaries, well, yeah, that's not going to happen. We love boundaries, whether we're talking about where we have to stop shoveling snow or mowing the lawn, and then it's the neighbor's job after that, or where we park our car or where we drive our car, or whether it's a boundary for a state or a country. These create an identity. We like to be Coloradans. We like to say these invisible lines make us a special group. And people who live in other places beyond those boundaries have their own special, cherished identities. So the idea of a boundaryless life, in part, it's not going to work because we like to belong to groups. We like to belong to communities, and boundaries help define those. But the prevalence and the power of boundaries in many different ways, in different formats, help to shape our daily lives, whether we're talking about state lines or boundaries that we interact with without really thinking about it as we go about our daily life. The power and the presence of boundaries is inescapable. And I am incredibly grateful that you joined me this evening to explore some of these lines. So I'm going to pause myself here. Let's see, I'll take my screen share off, and I'll turn things back over to Zach, and he can help coordinate any questions that have come up.
Thank you so much, Derek. First of all, there were some really great questions in the chat. The first one, I'm going to combine a couple of them. Are there any state boundaries that are still in dispute, or when were those last disputes settled? Or when did the last state boundaries?
That's a fantastic. Sure, that's a terrific question. The last state boundary in the United States to be created was actually the Dakotas one, splitting Dakota Territory north and south. And so theoretically, we haven't had any legal debates over where a state boundary should be since 1889. That being said, state boundaries show up in courts, and they show up in commissions between states on a regular basis. well, I mentioned the problem with rivers and how rivers tend to chop little pieces off from one state to another. Every once in a while, two states will have a compact. They'll have a commission that reassigns the pieces of land that exist from one state to another. Since the river has changed, let's take all the little pieces that should be ours and give them to you since they're attached to your state. Nebraska and Missouri have done this a number of times, for example. So it's easier to make sure that the laws are being enforced. That being said, those commissions, it's almost like a fool's errand, because as soon as you deal with your miscellaneous pieces on the wrong side, the river sneezes, and now you've got little pieces that are on the wrong side again. And so for most states, they just kind of accept that that's the way it is, and hope that nobody goes to those places to commit crimes because it's hard to enforce. One pertinent example: if you fly into Omaha and land at the airport there in Omaha, Nebraska, if you rent a car or get an Uber or a taxi or whatever to take you into downtown Omaha, you'll drive through a little piece of Iowa before you get back into Nebraska, except you haven't crossed the Missouri River or anything. There is the town of Carter Lake that has just been on that side of the river, but is officially part of Iowa and has remained so. So there is this debate that goes on. One other example I'll toss out has to do with the towns of Wendover and West Wendover. Wendover in Utah and West Wendover in Nevada. The communities have talked for a long time about becoming most likely all part of Nevada, of taking the Wendover, Utah part and just drawing a little line around the town to make it part of Nevada instead of Utah, because most of the people who work in West Wendover, where casinos and tourist things are, live on the Utah side of the line, where decent and virtuous people live and don't do scandalous things like happens on the west side of the line. So, I mean, this is an ongoing debate as to whether or not that boundary should be modified a little bit. But it's a good reminder that what we think are established communities and established lines, they have real complicating impacts for people every single day. For people who live near or along those state lines, it makes your life a little bit more complicated in just getting through your day-to-day existence.
Yeah, I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and the boundary there is a 4-lane road in the middle of the city. There are a couple of questions about weird state shapes. Someone asked about how did Idaho get its shape? You mentioned the Continental Divide, but there's other boundaries there. And then the southern boundary of Missouri and the Kentucky boot heel are just a little bit off from the rest of that baseline. Is there anything to that?
Starting with the Idaho part of the story, poor Idaho. Idaho is the leftovers of the American West. Idaho is essentially what was left when everything else was carved up, when there had been a Washington and an Oregon and a Montana and a Wyoming. Idaho was just the pieces, the scraps. There have been a lot of discussions over the years of splitting Idaho, of taking the Idaho panhandle, the northern part of the state, and attaching that to western Washington state, and maybe even drawing a line down the Cascades and say making the Seattle Olympia area its own state, and then the Columbia River Basin, Spokane and Yakima and that area, attaching the Idaho panhandle to that to create a more cohesive state. There's been a lot of support for that idea in Washington itself, because there's such a dramatic difference politically, economically, environmentally, on one side of the Cascades than the other. And so there's been a lot of talk about that. But yeah, let's put it this way: changing boundaries, even whether it's these little state commissions for a piece of a river here or there, or something big like creating a new state or moving pieces of states over, that is an incredibly complicated constitutional process. In Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution, it describes how new states can be created, whether out of existing states or new pieces of territory. And it requires the consent of the states that are involved. So, for example, to rearrange Idaho, you'd have to get the approval of the Idaho government, maybe a popular vote in Idaho, as well as the vote of people in Washington state. Then it would go to the federal government, and Congress would have to approve it. The president would have to sign it. It would be a huge legal process. And I can just about guarantee you that it will never happen, because if Congress does it once, they're going to have to do it a lot. It's kind of like the old "if you give a mouse a cookie" thing. One of the common stories that crops up in the American West is secession talk, not necessarily secession from the United States, but seceding from one state to join another or to create a new state. Northeastern Colorado talked about this in 2013. There was a vote for of several counties in Colorado as to whether they should create their own state or become a Wyoming panhandle or whatever. And there are a lot of these internal secession movements in the Western US. As I say, I can pretty much guarantee that none of them will ever be successful, because again, if Congress says yes to one of them, it's going to have to say yes to all of them. And we're going to have to buy new American flags with stars so tiny, because there's going to be so many stars with all the new states.
Uh-oh.
The southeastern corner comes about from a landowner named John. In the early 1800s, he owned a lot of land in what's now the Missouri Boot Heel, and he was concerned when Missouri was in the process of becoming a state. He was concerned that his land was going to be attached to the territory of Arkansas and not to the state of Missouri. And he thought that Missouri was going to be legally a smarter option for him and for his neighbors. You'd have more legal protections for your property in a state than you would in a territory, this sort of temporary government. And so Walker was able to use his economic power to convince the federal government to take this little bite out of and attach that land to Missouri so that his land would be there. Interestingly enough, if you look at a map of Missouri, up in the northeastern corner, where Missouri and Iowa and Illinois come together, there's a little chomp that was taken out of Missouri and attached to Iowa when Iowa became a state. And Missouri lost its mind when Iowa was asking for this little piece, and they said that it would destroy the integrity and the beauty of the state of Missouri. And you can imagine the Arkansas.
Well, I'm afraid we may have lost Derek.
Got to be in Missouri than in Arkansas.
Oh, some of that, the end of that cut off. I'm sorry, but it is. I think it's time for us to wrap up. At any rate, Derek, thank you so much. This has been really amazing talk. It's very interesting. So we're grateful to have you. I first of all would like to invite all of you to our next Borderlands talk. It's with Gustavo Ariano in a few weeks, on Thursday, February 11th. Gustavo Ariano he's been on Netflix, and he's the author of Taco USA. He's been on Ugly Delicious and the Taco Chronicles. He's a food writer. He's a writer for the LA Times. Writes especially about Mexican food, and he's going to be talking about Mexican food in the Borderlands, including Colorado. So I hope you'll join us for his talk. We also, the rest of this series this spring includes Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in March, Maria Montoya in April, and Norberto Valdez in May. Again, we want to thank the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area and Colorado State University Pueblo and all of our members and donors for making this programming possible at History Colorado Museums. To become more involved with the Borderlands of Southern Colorado initiative, we invite you to join our new Fronteras Borderlands membership. There's a link to that in the chat, and we'll send out a link to that afterwards, after the talk. But again, thank you to Derek. Thank you everyone who joined us tonight for the questions and for participating. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.